Representative Durfee, thank you very much for joining us here in the Ways and Means Committee room. We understand that your committee took extensive testimony on school meals, and you sent us a very comprehensive letter, which I appreciate. And I would just love you to tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing.
Sure. So for the record, Representative David Durfee of Shaftsbury, Chair of the House Agriculture, Food Resiliency and Forestry Committee. And yes, our committee has taken quite a bit of testimony this session after taking a lot more testimony, frankly, 2 years ago when the Universal School Meals bill was sent to us somewhat unexpectedly, since it had to do with education and taxes and appropriations. But we had the food resiliency piece in our committee, and we ended up recommending out a bill that passed with pretty strong support on the House floor and then was enacted 2 years ago. That brought statewide universal school meals to Vermont, which is what we've had now. The year before that, just for a little more history, the legislature had passed a different bill that had a pilot program that did more or less the same thing. The current law looks a little bit different from what I think we had 3 years ago. And then just for even more history, during the pandemic, there was universal school meals because the federal government supported that. So we've essentially had statewide universal school meals now since 2020, before the pandemic. So we have some data, we were able to look back. We were estimating, JFO is estimating, we were working with guesses as far as program cost 2 years ago, and now we have that much more information. So we were asked, just all the committees, as you know, you're doing serious work on education funding. We know that. And other committees have been asked to look at various pieces that would affect the education fund. So it made sense to, I guess, have us look again at how is the program working, but what is it costing? And what would the savings be if we weren't doing it? Which I think is, really sort of a key question. And I think what we've found is good news, really across the board, that the program is working as we hoped it would work in terms of feeding more students, more children, that it is helping farmers, that it is helping families with affordability issues, and that it's not costing the state as much as we thought it would. So originally, when we budgeted it 2 years ago, the estimate that went into the top line of the Ed Fund was $29 million. And by the way, I think I'm going to be followed by someone from JFO who can correct any numbers that I get wrong. But $29 million, it's turned out to be less. And for the FY26 fiscal year, it's expected to be 18.5 million.
And you were on Ways and Means when the sort of original work was done, right? And when it was expected.
3 years ago when we worked on that 1 year pilot. Yeah. So 18.5 is what's in the top line of the budget. And I will say 3 years ago, when I was on Ways and Means, we had sort of a general rule of thumb that $10 million was a cent on the property tax rate. And JFO has told us anyway that that's no longer the case. It's now 14 cents. I'm sorry. Yeah. 14 million equates to a cent. So just that's helpful in thinking about what does this actually mean if it were 18.5. The good news, though, is it's not actually 18.5. The savings that the state would realize would be considerably less than that if we did not have universal school meals. And I go into this in some detail in the letter, but I'll just explain why that's the case. If there were no universal school meals anywhere in the state, if no school district chose to do that, and they can, even if the state doesn't require it. School districts can and have done that on their own. But even if there were none, if no school districts do that, there would be costs that would be borne by each school district that would end up in the education fund. And we're able to quantify that because USDA, for some reason, has come up with an estimate that our agency of education is using. And it comes out to about $5.5 million across all the supervisory unions. They estimate about 100,000, roughly $100,000 per district. So, and we've got 50 some districts, so 5.5 million. And those are administrative costs that are associated with basically having people run a program that doesn't, have state feedback or state input. We know that historically, not all students pay for their meals, and we know that at the end of the day, school districts are loath to, maybe aren't allowed to let students go hungry. But collecting bad debt was something we heard about 3 years ago. We heard about 2 years ago that schools have to have people like building principals who should be doing other things, making phone calls to parents, writing letters. And then if that debt actually isn't paid, the schools have to come up with the money themselves. So that's another cost. And that was estimated to be about 1.5 million total statewide. There's also a requirement that school food authorities, the entities that are supplying the meals, they are not going to lose money. So they need to get money from each school district's general fund if they end up in the red. So that is another impact on the savings. And that one's harder to quantify. But even without that, I think we're pretty confident, and you'll hear that we're confident in saying that the actual difference in cost would be closer to 11 or 12 million dollars. That's in a scenario where no district decides to offer universal meals. We do know that before the pandemic, we had 77 schools who were offering it across the state. And when they do that, that comes out of the education fund. And we can't say that the number would be 77, but we can imagine that since no school has had to charge kids for meals since 2000, that suddenly doing that would be a challenge for parents, for the schools to set it up. And that many districts might just say, we're going to stick with this. If all school districts decided to go that route, there would be no savings at all, period. Because it would still be all $18.5 million would end up in the education fund. So somewhere between 0 and 11, say, is a good guess on what the impact would be on the education fund, 0 and $11 million. And so it's well under a penny. Again, 14 million being the 1 cent. There is another sort of set of arithmetic that I just want to mention. And that has to do with federal funding that school districts are able to draw down when they offer universal school meals. And JFO is estimating that in addition to all the other numbers we just talked about, that the state would bring in, their districts would bring in almost $17 million, 16.9 million. That if that money is not there, if there's no meals and students who don't qualify for free and reduced lunch through the federal government now have to buy their own meals, or their families do, have to think that that's money that parents now have to come up with, basically. So it's not just what the state's putting in. If we put into the education fund 18.5, there's federal money that's almost the same that's coming out. And that's all money that comes out of parents' pockets if the kids actually eat. There's a third financial piece of it. There are summer meal programs and after-school meal programs that are federally funded that we now have access to because of universal meals. That's another set of funds in the millions that would go away. So I know this is Ways and Means, and our focus was also on the financial impact. So that's what I've highlighted in the letter and highlighted here. Again, the program was intended to help more students get the nutrition that they need so that they're ready to learn, and help our farmers, help parents, obviously, as well.
We, in previous biennium, we took testimony about, the shame of a means tested program. We took a lot of testimony about the fact that, sort of the infrastructure that districts need to be able to do means testing, the savings to the education fund, the fact that, and this is certainly not the only place in the education fund this happens, when districts make different policy decisions, those policy decisions are carried by everyone. So if a few districts have universal school meals because they chose that, everyone is paying for that. And so to have sort of an equitable distribution of education fund dollars, universal meals makes sense. One thing that we have not taken a lot of testimony about, and I'm curious if you have, is there's been this rhetoric that I just noticed this year about like feeding millionaires kids. And I know from our work in this committee about just trying to understand how many millionaires there are in Vermont, that there aren't that many of them, and they tend to be older. So probably the few millionaires we have in Vermont do not have kids who are school age, and I just know that demographically. But I'm wondering if you took any more testimony about sort of the financial circumstance of the kids that are sort of at that edge where they're tipping over into needing to pay for their meals.
We did, and actually, for illustration purposes, in the letter have three sort of scenarios where families who currently are eligible because we have statewide universal school meals would lose that eligibility because their families make a little too much money to qualify for the federal free and reduced programs. And it's kind of shocking, actually. Yes, we hear just because, or we remember just because maybe it stands out that those students at families at the higher end of the income spectrum benefit, but also with the federal poverty level, it's 185% of the federal poverty level is the cutoff. So a single parent with two kids earning $50,000, I think. So that's,
That's a tight budget.
Yeah. And that's making $24 an hour, maybe, that person doesn't qualify. Those families wouldn't qualify. And then there's other examples in there too, but you sort of can get the idea there.
Yeah, Representative Canfield, and then wasn't that?
Your comparisons all along in here are with the free and reduced compared to the universal.
Yes. Well, I think, just want to be sure I understand what you're comparing there to, or what you're asking about, Phil.
You didn't mention it I didn't see it in the letter. But you were talking about free and reduced the meals program.
Yeah.
As compared to universal school meal.
In the scenarios?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I think that was the intention. Yeah, so under universal school meals, everybody qualifies, no questions asked. Nobody's asked to provide an affidavit on their income, anything like that. If we didn't have that program, then in those three scenarios, those families would not qualify, for free and reduced.
It was at the bottom of page 2, Rep. Canfield 2. The committee points out that it's at least 15,000 kids who are in that gap of not meeting their basic needs budget based off the JFO's basic needs budget who do not qualify for free and reduced because of so it's thousands and thousands of kids. And just pulling some math from the numbers that you provided in the letter, which was super helpful too. You have the $5.5 million that AOE estimates it would cost to reinstitute the program, the 1.5 million-ish in bad debt, the 16.9 million in lost federal money, and the 3.8 million in lost summer meal money. So we're losing $27.6 million in federal money to cut a program. It only costs $18.5 million-ish.
Do you have a, was that a question? So do you want to say right at the end? Good. Okay.
It's a good trick. I'm not sure that we're losing all that in federal funding. We're certainly losing the 16.9 and we're losing the summer program money. The rest of it, I think, is we're sort of lost to inefficiency.
So that's all just ed fund dollars we would have to spend that we're not spending now.
Exactly, so yes.
Anything else? Thank you so much for joining. Oh, sorry.
One question. You have in there the UVM study from 2020 that showed what the benefits were of the universal school meals. Is there any more recent research than that?
I don't know that it's more recent research, but I think that would be a good question maybe for Hungry Free Vermont, or the agency. They may have that, but I think that's the most recent. I think that's the most recent that was shared with us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for all the time you're committing
Thank
to
you.
this.
Thank you for having me.
We look forward to you coming back and telling us about all your work on current use.
Thank you.
Representative Higley, did you do something for
Actually, did.
Representative Durfee? I'm so sorry.
I'm just curious to know whether you got any information from schools as far as the number of kids that actually took advantage of this. I mean, I can give you an example of, our kids, when we used to feed them, make sure, because they got a long walk to the bus. We made sure they got fed. They complained, oh, we want breakfast. So we gave in. We finally said, okay. And we found out they didn't have any breakfast when they were down there. So I guess my question is, again, was there any numbers as far as the folks that still don't take advantage of the program?
Yes, we definitely had, and I think there's some numbers in the letter, but we did hear testimony on how many additional breakfasts and lunches were served annually. And it's, over 1 million collectively. I think maybe the uptake on breakfast was even stronger than on lunch. It's not to say, though, that every student is taking advantage of it or is eating a meal. And so the universal means it's available to everyone, not that everyone is either forced to take that meal, which is definitely not the case, or is choosing to take it either.
And the folks that supposedly qualify for taking the meal, they didn't necessarily take the whole meal. It might have been just a juice.
That I do not know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know I don't know in a cafeteria setting, when a student goes through the line, what, actually transacts.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Julia, you want to join us? Thank you so much. Hi again. New hour, new topic.
Sorry?
New hour, new topic, still the Ed Fund.
Yeah.
What can we do?
I'm Julia Richter with Grand Fiscal Office. There are some slides on the committee page under my name. Shall I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. While I am doing so, I will let you know that these slides are very similar to the testimony that I gave to House Ag. So
And I just want to say, folks, I told Julia to not spend an enormous amount of time making new slides for us because she has a lot of other stuff to do. And so some of them, they're for House Ag, who spends less time on some of this stuff than we do. And so we're gonna.
yeah, so I will say, while some of it is level setting, that I know the committee is aware, when I was going through and thinking how or if I would change the slides for this committee, I was thinking it's helpful level setting because it reminds us of how universal meals fits into the education fund and meals programs in general fit into the education fund. Do you want me to just start going through the slides or do you want me to answer specific? Okay. So
Yes, please go through the slides. Sorry.
So you all know we're nonpartisan, unbiased fiscal analysis.
Is there a limit of how many times you can say that to us in a single day?
I don't think so. I think it's start out.
For anybody online, right?
We get it.
I love it. No, I love that you get it, and I'm gonna keep saying it to remind everybody what my role is. So no policy recommendations coming from me, just information. So brief review of the Ed Fund in the context of universal school meals. Then we'll talk about the historical context of the universal school meals program, and then talk about the fiscal impact of repealing the universal meals program. Chair Durfee spoke to a lot of this testimony in his remarks. And so I may say high level, and I think it's helpful in terms of providing a framework of how to, at least how I'm thinking through the potential repeal. So review of the Ed Fund. We all know this, that the revenues and expenditures are interconnected. It's a statewide fund, meaning that all spending decisions at the state level and at the local level are impacting and affecting the entire system, not property taxpayers. It's a system that couples local and state decisions. We know that expenditures are determined at the state and local level. We know that property tax rates are set to fully fund those expenditures. And that they're all dedicated to the statewide education fund. Little graphic here. As a way, I think, of framing the conversation and thinking about the expenditures. I know that we've talked about the buckets.
I love that graphic.
Thank you. I don't usually include graphics for you all, but basically the way to think about it is we've got the education fund, and the Ed Fund is a sum of all expenditures on education coming out of the state. So we've got our local spending decisions, right? All of our school district budgets that are being paid for out of the education fund. And we've got all of our state spending decisions. Which means that changes at the state level impact the total expenditures, but so do changes and decisions at the local level. Which we'll get into how that rolls into what may happen with the repeal of universal meals. With a repeal, if it were to happen. So reminder, we're setting property tax rates annually to fully fund the education system. And that leads us into a historical overview of the universal meals program. So thinking about the universal meals program and how it's funded, there's federal and state funding for meals, and this is based on the family's income level. So as Chair Durfee spoke about, there's different amounts of federal funding that are allocated based off of a family's income level or the identification of a certain student from a certain income level, right? So students who fall in that lowest category of income are receiving the most federal dollars, are considered free meals. And then there's the reduced meals, which is still federal funding, but less than the free. And then there's the paid students who are above that threshold, but there's still a slight reimbursement from the feds for all of those paid students. The way that the Universal Meals Program works is it essentially says all students in schools are going to, at the state level, qualify as free students, meaning that the state dollars are going to make up that difference between the free rate and the paid rate. And this cost is estimated to be $18.5 million in fiscal year 2026. And this is assuming that there's no immediate changes at the federal level in terms of federal funds and reimbursement rates. So I've been asked a lot this session, well, what did the landscape look like before the Universal School Meals Program? Can't we use that as a proxy to know what would happen if universal meals were to be repealed for fiscal year 2026. And that's why I've included this slide here, that it's really hard to look back and interpret what was happening pre-pandemic in historical trends to what might happen in fiscal year 26 if universal meals were to be repealed. And that's for a number of reasons. The COVID-19 pandemic happened. There have been changes to federal policy, and there have been changes to state policy and other pieces like cultural changes that are outside of my bailiwick that I'm not going to mention. But it's really hard to compare to pre-pandemic, to a pre-universal meals program. So looking forward, I think that's where we're going next. Oh no, we're going through the history of universal meals. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were 77 Vermont schools that provided universal meals to their students. This was done from federal funding. So there's two ways essentially of drawing down federal funds for meals. There's the community eligibility provision, provision 2. Essentially, those are different ways of calculating the reimbursement going to school food authorities. So there was the federal dollars coming in, and there were also the delta that needed to be made up, those extra dollars to provide the universal school meals was coming from school budgets, which, because school budgets are statewide, was coming from the statewide education fund. And then the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and there was federal funding for universal school meals. So the state did not need to make up that difference. And all schools had universal school meals through federal dollars. After the pandemic in 2022, there was this 1-year state-funded program for FY23, and this was that first year of universal school meals. So breakfast and lunch, all publicly funded students, and it was funded as a one-time Ed Fund categorical aid appropriation. And Chair Durfee referenced this. This was that 29 million from a few years ago. The following year, Act 64 established the state program to provide universal school meals, and that was included in the Green Books. So this now lives in Title 16, along with those other categorical aid programs that we see outlined in the Education Fund Outlook.
Yeah. Do schools spend money on school meals separate from the universal school meals line item and separate from federal money?
My understanding is yes.
And that's just in their budgets, and we don't really have data on that.
Yeah, Rosie Kruger at AOE is, most of you probably know her, excellent. She's their state director of child nutrition programs, and she's really the expert on all of this. So this is where I get a lot of my data and information from. And she provided a lot of data to House Ag about this. And she did talk about the education fund impact from local budgets. And she was estimating that somewhere in the ballpark of 5 million, 6 million, 7 million. I haven't had a chance to ask her how she got that number, but we do know that school districts are receiving the federal dollars. They're receiving the universal meals supplement. But if the provision of universal school meals or meal programs is more costly for the school district, or the school district decides to provide school meals in another manner, they may supplement those funds with funds in their own budget, which also are coming out of the education fund. It's all Ed Fund dollars. So the Universal Meals Program was established in the Green Books, and that's where we are today. Looks like somehow the slide got in here twice. So the fiscal impact of repealing the Universal School Meals Program. So in terms of understanding the current law costs, we've talked about the fact that universal meals categorical aid is estimated to be about 18.5 million in statewide education fund. It's categorical aid, so it's that off the top, meaning that that cost is being borne uniformly by all property taxpayers, right? It's not being included in that ed spending, so districts' tax rates are not fluctuating up or down from the universal meals supplement.
Schools receive that money directly, or is it coming through the state?
You mean the flow of dollar?
Yeah.
The universal meals, it's an appropriation to the Agency of
So I
Education.
was thinking about the federal.
Oh, I actually don't know how the federal funds, that'd be, Rosie would know. Yeah, I don't know how the federal dollars flow to school food authorities. So it's categorical aid, 18.5 million. We know that rough estimate, 14 million is about a penny. So that's 1 to 1.5 cents on both the homestead and the non-homestead property tax rate. So what happens if universal school meals were to be repealed? Well, we need to look at both pieces of what makes up the ed fund. We need to think about the local spending decisions and the state spending decisions. So a repeal of the universal school meals would mean that school districts would no longer receive that categorical aid from the education fund for the purpose of universal school meals. School districts would then need to decide locally whether they wanted to continue to operate a universal school meals program or if they were to return to a pricing program. Every district's impact decision to that question would impact the education fund. And the impact on the education fund would differ based on their decisions. So fiscal impacts of returning to a pricing program. So essentially what this would mean would be that school districts would go back to how it was pre-universal school meals, where you've got students paying for their portion of the meals. The federal dollars would still be coming in. But one cost that Chair Durfee mentioned is that there is going to be estimated by USDA and the AOE an increase in administrative burden and associated costs to school districts to return to a pricing program. So AOE pointed me to this estimate, which is that every school food authority saves a little over 100,000 per year in administrative costs through a universal meals program. So we can interpret the converse, right? If a school district were to decide to return to a pricing program, then that increase in administrative costs would be borne in a district budget. And thus, because district budgets are fully funded from the statewide education fund, that cost would also fall to the statewide ed fund. If a school district were to return to a pricing program, we also know that any unpaid meal charges would be borne by the education fund. There's been universal meals in Vermont going back to the beginning of the pandemic. So if you think about the students in school going into, I don't know, in 4th or 5th grade, having not had to pay for a meal before, there's a question of how meal charges would respond if you're returning to a pricing program. If students aren't paying those costs, it still is a cost that needs to be borne by the school district. So those costs are going to fall to the statewide ed fund.
So if it can, so those 77 school districts that used to, that's about a third of the school districts in the state, they were already getting that pricing program through the statewide property tax, correct?
Yeah, so if I may, so it's 75, maybe I misspoke, 77 schools, not 77 school districts,
Oh, okay, so
schools.
schools.
And yes, you are correct. So the way that those statewide program, those districts that needed to make up a cost for the universal school meals program, that cost went to the ed fund, which was then borne by property taxpayers. Yes. It was borne in a different way than it is under current law. Before, it was borne by all property taxpayers, but the homestead taxpayers in that district saw a proportional increase in their rate where there was that increase in cost. Whereas under current law, it's spread uniformly to the state. Does that answer your question? Okay. So that's one extreme, that school districts would return, all school districts would return to pricing programs. And by extreme, I mean like when we talk about those bounds, that's one bound. The other bound is that all school districts decide to maintain a universal meals program. Right, so if a school district decides, even though the categorical aid is being gone away with, we want to maintain the universal meals program, they could make that choice. And the cost of maintaining that universal meals program would fit into that district's education spending, which would mean that it still would be covered by the education fund. It would be just shifting from the categorical aid line into the education payment line, right? It wouldn't be a removal of costs. It would just be moving where that cost is showing up in the ed fund. Getting to Rep. Higley's question, this is where the shift would be how it's realized in the property tax rate. So by shifting the cost from the categorical aid into the education payment, you would see those school districts that were deciding to maintain a universal meals program, they would see a proportional increase in their homestead tax rate, and all property taxpayers would still cover that school district's universal meals program to some degree. So we talked about one extreme or one bound where all school districts return to a pricing program. The other bound is all school districts decide to continue a universal meals program. In that case, we estimate that the cost would be exactly the same. It would just be in a different line in the education fund outlook. We know that repealing universal meals means that the amount of federal funding may decrease. The extent to which it would decrease would again depend on local school districts' decisions, right? Depending on how school districts decided to move to a pricing program or maintain a universal meals program. So this is one way where it's difficult for us to estimate how much federal funding would be lost because we don't know what school districts would do. AOE does estimate that with the universal meals program, that results in an additional 16.9 million in federal funding coming to the state for the universal meals program. That's where that 16.9 million.
Yes, that's right.
In Chairman Durfee's letter, he also brought up the 3.8 million in summer meal money. Do you happen to, and Rosie knows this, do you happen to know if that's inclusive in the 16.9 or is that additional?
My understanding is that's additional.
That's what I thought you just checked. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm focusing very much on
Yes.
solely universal school meals and recognizing there are other pieces that are being touched that I'm not talking about today.
Thank you.
So summarizing the savings of or fiscal impacts of repealing universal meals program on the ed fund depend on local district decisions. So we can't estimate right now what those savings would entail because we don't know what local school districts would decide to do in their budgets with respect to a meal program. If they were to return to a pricing program, we know that there would be administrative costs and food debt that would be borne in the district budget. If they were to maintain the universal meals program, we know that the same cost would still be hitting the education fund. Finally, a couple other fiscal considerations that I don't think I've spoken to in as much detail, but that it's really challenging to think about what happened pre-COVID because of all of the changes. Another change that I haven't spoken about today is that one of the pieces that we've seen is that the estimated cost of universal school meals has really decreased over the past several years. One of the primary reasons that it's decreased is because more students are able to draw down more federal funding. One of the reasons of that is Vermont's excuse me, Vermont's enrollment in the Medicaid Direct Certification Program, which essentially means that students enrolled in Medicaid can automatically be counted for the drawdown of federal funds without needing to fill out that paperwork, which has led to the identification of a lot more students who are eligible to draw down those federal funds. So that's why we have seen that state cost decrease over time. Another piece that I wanted to flag that I haven't spoken about today is we're at the end of the school district budgeting season, right? The school district budgets start to be built in the beginning of the fall, late summer. And voters typically vote on budgets on town meeting day and 6 days from now. So because universal school meals is a statutory program, school districts were generally assuming that the provision of those funds would be coming to the school districts during the building of their 2026 budgets. So I've talked to a few business managers. It's in no way, I'm not speaking for the business managers, but in some conversations I've had, I've heard that they're assuming the provision of the universal meals program will continue in their budget development. In which case, if universal meals were to be repealed and school districts have already passed budgets that were assuming the provision of universal school meals aid, then there's the question of then what, right? Are school districts going to try to reopen their budgets, dig into the reserves? Do they need to return to a pricing program? There's a lot of questions because we're kind of at the end of the budgeting cycle for FY26. And then to Rep. Wazazak's point, the estimated loss of area eligibility for some of those other after-school programs and other dollars for other nutrition programs.
Thank you very much, Julia. Really appreciate it. Abby, you want to join us? We are totally changing topics. We are stepping away from the education fund for a minute. So relieving. There is a piece in the miscellaneous tax bill, which right now is H-135, about the clarifying the taxation of a tobacco product, a nicotine product, not a tobacco product, a nicotine product. And I found myself confused about it and asked for some clarification from tax about it. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. For the record, Abby Shepard, I'm the Executive Policy Advisor at the Department of Taxes. I'm an attorney and I know many of you.
Can we just wait 1 second? Sure, thanks.
So yes, totally different topic from what you were just all.
I'm really excited about that. It's like deep in the weeds and doesn't have very much money attached to it, and that sounds nice.
This issue, I'd be happy to be as high level or deep in the weeds as what I'm looking at first. Sorry.
Okay, I think the traffic has calmed somewhat and you can start talking again. Thank you.
So I'm from the Department of Taxes. I'm here to talk about H-135. It's section 8. It starts on page 11 if you want to look at the language. Really the high level proposal was to amend 2 definitions to capture sort of changing products out there. So as the chair mentioned, this is the tobacco products tax, not cigarette tax. It's a separate tax. However, we're talking about products that are changing. The market has really expanded in the last few years. They are using types of nicotine that may not be derived from tobacco, that may be synthetically derived. So the department has heard a lot about this as the sales have increased and there have been questions about the revenues and the taxation of these products. So our interpretation, because there is a statutory presumption of taxability, is that these products generally are taxable. I think you've heard about different brand names that might be helpful. Zyn, On, Velo brands. These are all nicotine pouches. So I'm not an expert and would ask that you speak to someone who has more expertise, like the AG's office or Department of Health.
He's not interested in coming in to testify, and neither is the Department of Liquor and Lottery, which I thought was another possibility. And so I've been like, does anyone know anything about smokeless tobacco products?
Not an expert, but from the tax administration side, so these are products that are, my understanding from Googling, more and more folks are using these because of the stigma attached to cigarettes and other types of tobacco products. These are very discreet. You put them in your mouth, so you get the nicotine in a different way. You're not actually having to smoke it. So there are also lozenges that also deliver the nicotine. So these are generally our understanding, the way that these products are manufactured, they meet the definition of what you'll see in this language of new smokeless tobacco. So that requires a certain amount of moisture content and also a size. There are two different weight-based taxes that are applied to these products. So that said, because of the statutory language that we have in Vermont, and also we are aware of some litigation in other states like in Texas, where a manufacturer was able to successfully appeal on a very technical definitional basis, a Texas law claiming that these products were not taxable because they were not made of tobacco or a tobacco substitute. So the way our statute is written, we interpret that these are already captured under the statute, but we wanted to clarify to avoid any sort of lawsuits or questions, because our ultimate concern here is not whether something is or is not taxed, it's whether it's easy for us and clear for us to administer. So we're not saying you should or should not tax these. Our intent is really to make it clear so that we know how to actually administer the tax. Let's see, so I'll pause there.
I'm trying to get my head around, so there's sort of like the other tobacco products, which I generally think of as like pipe tobacco kind of universe. And then there's the smokeless new things, which this feels more
That's what's brought up.
related to. And
Yes,
so the two, and in the clarifying language, it looks like it could sometimes be in one and sometimes be in the other. And I would just love to know more about your research about like what would make it hang out in one place rather than the other sometimes, and what are the tax implications of those two things?
right. So the new smokeless tobacco has those weight-based, there are two. So the vast majority, my understanding, are the very small packages. So it would be a $3.08 per package tax is what my understanding, most of those would be taxed under. However, if a type of product doesn't meet those very strict definitions, so let me just look at the language. It has to be not intended to be smoked, has a moisture content of less than 45%, or is offered in individual single-dose tablets or discrete single-use units. If a product did not meet those very specific requirements, and we've really assumed that that would be the moisture content, we wanted to make sure they would still be captured by the other tobacco products definition, because that's the catch-all definition that our understanding is these would all go under the new smoke list, but we wanted to make sure that statute was cleaned up. So you didn't have another loophole, trying to close one loophole and creating another way, like a very technical way to avoid the tax.
Okay, so it's almost always going to hang out in new smoke lists, but you didn't want people to like, I mean, a company could then change things slightly in order to try to get in the other category, and you wanted to close that. Okay, that is very helpful for me. Yeah.
Abby, the tax is collected at the wholesale,
Correct. That's right.
not the retail.
So the only time you would have a retailer collecting the tax is if they're in possession of something that has not been taxed, then the liability attaches to the retailer. But yes, it's generally on the wholesale sale where this is charged.
Yeah, Representative Brannigan?
And these are carcinogenic items.
They do have, I don't know that I can speak to that. My understanding is yes, so they're tobacco products, and they contain nicotine. So I suppose, but I am not the expert. Yeah, I don't know what that would be defined. That's not part of these definitions.
I know that the Human Services Committee took an enormous amount of testimony last year, unfortunately, related on sort of all of the details of any product like this, especially the newer products. And so probably someone who was on that committee last year could help you understand that better. We invited the Department of Health to come in, and they decided not to. I don't know why.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
And so these products aren't currently taxed, correct?
They should be.
They
collecting
should.
tax, yes.
Okay.
And our understanding is, and we do have some revenue numbers if you're interested to show that over the last
That would
7
be-
years, the revenues have increased dramatically.
If you have that, that'd be great.
Sure.
Because again, you mentioned Zin, I think that's.
That's the one that most
Yeah,
people,
I'm
if
most
you,
familiar with that, yeah.
if you Google new smokeless tobaccos in is what pops up.
But have you got those specific amounts on what we're referring to here?
I have some notes and maybe we could provide something looking to our data physical analyst. If you're interested to have something in writing, but looking at the revenue over the last 7 years, so since fiscal 18, the revenues and through fiscal 24 have increased almost 13 times. So the tax revenues, we're not talking about the sales, but the actual tax revenues for new smokeless.
2018 to
tobacco.
2024.
Correct, fiscal years.
Fiscal, okay.
Years. Yep. And so that's been an increase from approximately 170,000 in fiscal 18 to 2.34 million in fiscal 24. But the number of filers has been roughly the same throughout that period. And it's an average of 12.
The filers are the wholesalers, though, remember? That's why the wholesaler number.
Yeah, not retailers, right? Correct.
Thanks.
And then I believe you were maybe interested in comparison to the other tobacco products tax. I don't know if that's useful to hear as well. New smokeless tobacco has outpaced the revenues for other tobacco products tax by about 16% in this current fiscal year, or sorry, in fiscal year 24. And the other tobacco products tax revenues, so again, looking at that fiscal 18 to fiscal 24 period, they've increased about 1.6 times. So not nearly the same growth as the new smokeless tobacco products revenues. Same, the filers have stayed about the same. It's an average of 20 a year. And I did just want to note that we don't have, just like with the sales tax, a lot of the revenues that we collect, we don't have generally product-based information. So we couldn't say for all the wholesalers who are selling Zyn, these are the revenues from this particular product. We don't have that. Yeah.
Representative Brannigan was next.
Well, two other questions. You said the tax revenue increased over the last 6 or 8 years or something like that. Did we increase the rate?
No.
No,
No.
it just did, that increase was from more thorough collection.
I don't know if there was more collection, but more sales is my understanding, and perhaps more volume, because this is generally it's weight-based or package-based, so more is being bought.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And also, what do we do with that tax money?
Great question. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I didn't think to research that.
Chris, do you know what to do?
Thank you.
It's bucketed into the healthcare taxes.
And what's your name?
Chris Richards.
My memory of last year's testimony about testimony was that there's just there's been a shift from tobacco to other smokeless products or smokeful product, whatever. I don't know what to, yeah.
Smokeless tobacco, new smokeless tobacco. is the statutory term.
I don't, like, that's never gonna stop in my brain.
It's not real.
Yeah.
My confusion then is, what's the purpose of this legislation? Is it already taxed, but you're trying to clarify its definition?
Correct. Partly because the statute is not explicit right now about synthetic nicotine. So our interpretation is that it should be taxed currently, and we want to be clear that even if it's a synthetically based nicotine, like many of these products are, we want to avoid the Texas style litigation of this isn't made from or derived from tobacco, so it's not taxable. So we're trying to just keep our understanding of the statute, especially with the OTP as the catch-all definition, is that these were intended to be taxed under the tobacco products tax.
But currently, people have been paying the tax on it.
Correct.
You just want to cover your backside to make sure that we know,
Exactly.
right?
That's, yes, perfect summary. Thank you.
And so I just want to make sure I'm understanding right. The confusion falls into the fact that all of the nicotine products in the world were tobacco products, and all of our sort of statutory definitions involve the word tobacco. And now there's new fancy stuff that doesn't involve the word tobacco, that is basically the same product.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
Any other questions for you on this one? Okay, I have another question. Yeah. So in same bill. And I think we took a few minutes of testimony about this, but it seems like it was a very long time ago. So I just wanted to have a little brain refresher. This whole idea of clarifying joint filing. Can you tell us just a little bit about it?
Hadn't prepared the whole bill in detail, but I can give you just a quick review. So this is section 3 on page 3 of the bill. There are some very, very old regulations that we don't use regularly, and we realized are still on the books with the Secretary of State, that the department in the 60s, I believe, had enacted that allows for Vermont filing statuses to differ from federal filing statuses, and that is very unusual in most states. And we in fact have guidance saying you must file the same as what you file federally, with very limited exceptions for spouses where one is a non-Vermont resident. So they're married, but they're allowed to file separately in Vermont if one spouse is not living in Vermont or has no Vermont income. So we do actually have a technical bulletin on that, which I'd be happy to send to the committee. So our proposal here is to make it clear that with our current practice and what most states do, clarify statute that rather than a discretionary may file a Vermont personal income tax return under the same filing status as federally, we want it to be a mandatory shall, which is how we have been administering it. And then we have this discretionary, that's the last 2 lines there on lines 5 and 6, unless the commissioner allows a different filing status, and that would be in the case of a married filing jointly federally, but with a non-resident spouse. So you would still have the option to file separately in Vermont in those circumstances, because they have no Vermont income.
And so this is another place where you just want statute to reflect your current practice, so there's no confusion.
And so we don't have to go through the whole rulemaking process to change the regulation, and it's our practice anyway. So within the statute is the cleanest way to make the really technical change in our eyes.
Any questions from anyone on this?
Great.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's great.
We're happy to come in on any other proposals. I know you heard from the
I know
former
Kirby,
commissioner.
sorry, one more. Kirby made some slight language changes to the language that you sent over, and that works for you?
Yes, I think one of them was changing, I think we had proposed artificial, he changed it to synthetic, which is.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Folks, we are done for the day. Please take the extra time to read the language that Kirby took us through this morning more thoroughly, because we're hearing a testimony about it tomorrow morning.